It's also a privilege to welcome Dr. Gill King from Harvard University to our campus today. Now, Gary, welcome to the school, but also we're delighted to have you here. And thank you for, we look forward to your insights, and thank you for sharing them with us today. Since 2000, the Gill Family Foundation has supported, as Jim mentioned, 13 recipients of the Gill Fellows. Now, these students, which have all had great success, but what distinguishes them is they were chosen to be Gill Fellows based on their interest in and the capacity to do sophisticated methodological research and to incorporate that into their dissertations. Today, these 13 graduates serve as policy experts in a variety of educational, non-governmental, and policy think tanks. Jeff, we're grateful for that legacy that you have helped develop, and the Gill Families Foundation through the endowment that allows us to support students. Supporting exceptionally talented students on the road to success is the sort of thing that just warms your heart as a dean, to see that that sort of support is available. I also want to take a moment to recognize Jim Thurber, whom most of you know, as director of the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies. Jim is responsible for this event happening. He's responsible for Jeff Gill's success in part. Now, you had to go away and use what you learned from him. But without good teachers, we wouldn't have successful graduates who could go on and do remarkable things in the market. The Campaign Management Institute and the Public Affairs Advocacy Institute are two of the initiatives that are under the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies. They are shining examples of what we can do at American University. Jim, through his center, provides extraordinary opportunities to students for educational opportunities, research opportunities, and in particular outreach to practitioners in the field so that they can learn both the theory and the practice of public affairs. My thanks to Jim and the team at the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies for organizing this. Without their personal support, all of you wouldn't be having the fine lunch you've got today, and we wouldn't have these great speakers here. Now, as some of you know, the School of Public Affairs is in the midst of a 3-year plan to expand our ability to have impact through the excellent work we already do. Having these distinguished speakers, recognizing this distinguished alumnus, are examples of the kind of things that we can do. Extraordinary accomplishments in the educational arena, extraordinary loyalty from distinguished alumni, and the opportunity to bring in distinguished speakers such as Gill King. So thank you all for coming. Jim, I turn it back to you.
Thank you, Barbara. As you know, in the program, there's detailed backgrounds of both No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to, though, summarize a little bit about Jeff Gill. Jeff is really terrific. He's published over 40 articles in referee journals. He has 8 books. His books are widely adopted. One of them, Essential Mathematics for Political and Social Science Research, and also a 3rd edition of Bayesian Methods for Social and Behavioral Sciences. He continues the tradition of helping students along, and he's placed students recently from Washington University in St. Louis at Princeton, Chapel Hill, UNC Chapel Hill, Indiana, University of California at Davis. And he does this because he has broken down, in my opinion, the silos of academia, as Gary has. We're siloed, and it's very hard to break them out. And he has, as you know, a joint appointment with a variety of institutions at WashU. He's a professor at Department of Political Science, Department of Surgery, and the Division of Biostatistics. He does epidemiology as well as political science. He His areas of focus are methodology and statistics, with a focus on Bayesian approaches, Markov chain, Monte Carlo, queuing theory. He is, in my opinion, sorry Gary, but he's a star. And one of the reasons he's a star in this area is because he worked with you as a postdoc at Harvard, and he's gone on, he's done just terrific things. And his family, and Jeff was really the force behind this, established this Gill Family Foundation Scholarship, which has made a difference here, and our students have gone off to a variety of institutions of higher education after writing these really great quantitative-oriented dissertations. But the commonality between the two is that both of them have broken down these silos. And statistics and methods help do that. It's a language. It's a language that you can use within political science, with sociology, and School of International Service. And we are doing that here because of the direction of our leaders. Scott Bass in particular is pushing this, and our provost, and we appreciate that. Gary is the Albert J. Weatherhead III University Professor at Harvard. He's one of 24 university professors at Harvard. That's a great distinction. And he's director, and we all know about his work at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science, with an appointment also in the Department of Government. He's had 40 Best of Awards. That's where we can go on for 30 minutes to list them. I'm not going to do this. 150 referee journal articles, 8 books, 20 open source software packages that he's produced. He's collaborated, and he's known for this. He's collaborated with his postdocs, his students. He's collaborated with 70 scholars elsewhere, but also that you've worked with directly. His research support comes from a variety of sources: NSF, CDC, World Health Organization. He's the former president of the Society for Political Methodology and vice president of the American Political Science Association. I don't know how you did that, because that's a thankless job, being the vice president of that. He's here to talk about reverse engineering censorship in China. And as I said before, the timing is incredible, because today we have a front page article above the fold. For those of you that know about newspapers, okay? There's this thing, get ink on your hands and stuff. But it came up, when you pulled it up on your computers, on censorship in China, and also a long one in the Washington Post, not on the front page. It should have been. But we welcome you, Gary. Thank you for coming down.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm going to talk about reverse engineering censorship in China, but I should probably start by giving you some sense of how it was that I came to study a subject like this, because I don't know. You can't see this, right? Can you see that? Can you see that a little bit?
Point it to the computer.
I don't think so. It's a laser, so you all be nice to me. Okay, so anyway, I'll just point. I'm pointing at that. Okay, so I don't really know Chinese. In fact, I don't know Chinese. I don't know Chinese at all. I've never studied censorship. I'm not an engineer, but I do things backwards sometimes. So how did I get to do this? So what we actually intended to study, Jen Pan and Molly Roberts and I, Jen and Molly are two of my graduate students. Jen is going to start at Stanford as assistant professor in the fall, and Molly just started at UCSD. So we decided we were going to write a paper on automated text analysis. There's an enormous amount of unstructured text in the world, just text. And it's becoming possible to analyze it quantitatively, because it's not possible for any one person to read it all. It's just no longer, it's just like the argument between quantitative and qualitative methods, it's over. It's just not possible for a human being to read it all. And, for a lot of things, it's not possible to do automatically, but sometimes actually we can we can empower humans to understand things better by giving them access to vast amounts of material and some methods to analyze it. So we developed some of these methods, and we worked hard on extending them. And we were proud of this particular method that we developed, and we thought, let's stress test this. Let's push it until it breaks. How would we do that? As it happens, Jen and Molly both speak Chinese. So we thought, let's try it in Chinese. We developed it in English. Wouldn't this be cool? right? So we went and we got a big database of social media posts. We got it from a local company called Crimson Hexagon, which actually I founded. It commercialized some previous technology that I developed in studying automated text analysis, Dan Hopkins and I, who's at a neighboring Yale University. So we developed this methodology. We went to Crimson Hexagon. We said, send us a database. They sent us a database of social media posts, and what was in it was the text of each post, like Twitter and Facebook, but in China they have the equivalent, not the actual, not Twitter and Facebook, but things like it. They had the text, and then they had a URL, right, for each one. And we reanalyzed the data, and we pushed forward our methods, and we were about to write this great paper on automated text analysis, and we were going to even include parts that explained how to do automated text analysis in Chinese. We thought this would be great. And they were in my office, and I said, you know what, why don't you guys go back to the website from which some of these posts came, and just make sure that we have the context right. Make sure Crimson Hexagon is pulling the text of the post, not the ads, right? And that we just understand what it looks like and the whole thing. So they click on some of the sites. They go back home, and they come back to my office, and they say, we think there's something wrong with the data from Crimson Hexagon. Because sometimes you click on the post, and it doesn't go anywhere. Sometimes it does. And I said, show me. So they go to my computer, and they click on some of them, and the post comes up, and sure enough, it's all in Chinese, and I can't read it. But sometimes they click on it, and nothing happens. It just waits and waits and waits. And then we clicked a couple more times, and sometimes it says something about being investigated. And all of a sudden, we realized, Crimson Hexagon and us, were able to get Chinese language social media posts before the Chinese government could read and censor them. We had the whole corpus of social media posts that the Chinese people couldn't read because they weren't allowed to, but we could. We had them all. So we thought, let's forget that study about automated text analysis. And so basically we had an enormous number of social media posts, and we went back to each post to see whether it was censored or not. And we labeled them all as zeros and ones, censored or not censored. And then we tried to figure out, reverse engineered what the Chinese government was after. Okay. I think I should see what we're doing too. So this is the result of some of our work. The first two there's an observational study that I'm going to tell you about. There's an experimental study, and there's a participatory study. We're going to participate in censorship. I'll explain that when we get there. It'll be a lot of fun. Okay. And so we published one paper in the American Political Science Review last spring and in Science magazine this spring, or a few months ago. And then these are the papers that I really care about that you're not going to let me talk about, which are the methods papers. So this is a good example of the kind of work that Jeff does as well, where you start in one area, and then it turns out there's something completely different that's utterly unrelated to what you thought you were studying. These are really cool, but you'll have to flinch, and then I'll talk about them. So anyway, so let's orient ourselves. What's Chinese censorship? So it's the largest selective suppression of human expression in the history of the world. Okay? It is implemented manually, that is by hand, within a few hours of posting. That is, few hours of you put something on the web, if you did it in China. People sit and read. How many people? 100,000, 200,000 people. Okay. Now you'd think that's a lot, but that particular research cost is not very high in their books, right? They have a lot of those. So it's by an enormous number of people. And they're located inside governments and also inside social media firms. Quite like in the US, actually, we have people located inside social media firms that are in charge of censorship. We wouldn't call it censorship, we would call it removing illegal material, like child pornography. Of course, the Chinese government says, that's the same thing. We just remove illegal material. Okay. Think about how you would do this task. Okay. Suppose you're in charge of the censorship program. You hire 200,000 of your closest friends. And what do? How do you do this? How do you explain to them what to do? You can put them in a big stadium, and you say, here's what we're going to do, right? And then if anybody's ever done hand coding projects, what kind of intercoder reliability do you think you would achieve? Particularly given how much these guys are getting paid? Not very much, right? Okay, this is a big operation. It is a huge censorship organization. It is obviously designed to suppress information. That's its purpose. What we discovered, paradoxically, is that it is the same organization is very revealing about the goals and intentions and the actions of the Chinese leadership. Okay, and so it's like a big elephant tiptoeing around. It leaves huge footprints. And because we're looking in a way that no one's ever looked before, at enormous scale, we can see the footprints. Everybody else, including us, were like the ants crawling around. We didn't notice that there were footprints. We were just looking at the grains of sand. But when you have a telescope that looks at it in a different way, you get to see different things. And so precisely because they suppress information at such a large scale, they show us stuff that we wouldn't have seen before. Okay, so what's Chinese social media? In the US, there's a large number, in the US, there's a small number of very large social media companies. Facebook and Twitter and Tumblr and Pinterest and a couple of others. In China, they also have big social media companies, but they have a large number of smaller social media companies. So this is a collage of some of the sites. Okay? We found 1,400 sites. I'm happy to say we published this in the American Political Science Review. I believe it's the first collage ever published in the American Political Science Review. They let us do that, isn't that cool? And also, those of us in quantitative analysis know you don't use pie charts. They really don't work well. They're not a good way to represent quantitative information. However, sometimes they look especially cool. So we also published this. This is the size of the social media sites. And there's some big ones, but as you can see, there's an extremely long tail. Isn't it pretty? Right? So this is how big they are. So that's Chinese social media. It's fractured across all these places, right? Across all these different, and that makes the logistics of studying it a little more difficult than, let's say, downloading your Twitter, the Twitter feed or something like that. Okay. All right, so let's focus on the goals of censorship. If you know the goals of censorship, then observing what they do can make social media actionable, both for the Chinese leaders and also for us, because we can see what they're doing. Okay. So for starters, everybody knows the basic goal of censorship. It's to stop criticism and protest and collective action about the state, its leaders, and their policies. Everybody knows this. Everybody knew this. Everybody wrote about this. Everybody said this. We studied this. The first thing we learned is that this is utterly and completely wrong. Okay. That's not the goal. Okay. So what's the goal? I said to Jen and Molly, and they said to me, right? We had no idea, okay? But this was not it, okay? So we tried a lot of times and came up with another idea. By the way, the idea, reverse censorship sounds cool, doesn't it? Suppose I said post hoc justification of hypotheses. So I know this is what I'm going to tell you is true because we reverse engineered it, okay? It's completely consistent with the data. We also did it lots and lots of times, so we were vulnerable to being proven wrong. But in any event, separate thing. So what's the goal? What's the point of, what is it that they're after? What we realized is that we could take that first sentence that I crossed out, and we could separate it into two things. One goal being stopping criticism of the state, and the second being stopping collective action, that is protest or rallies or things like that. And what we learned when we finally realized to separate those two things out is that the first is wrong and the second is right. And the results are, which I will show you, are unambiguous. They don't care what you say about them. You can say the nastiest things about the leaders of the Chinese government. I mean, you can say that the leaders of this town are stealing money. This is how much they're stealing. These are the overseas bank accounts they're putting it in. And by the way, they all have mistresses, and here are their names. Okay? It can be completely personal, and it's not only the leaders of your town, it goes right up to the top leaders of the country. Okay? You can say anything you want about them. Okay? However, if you say, and let's go protest, they will censor you. Okay? In fact, if you say, the leaders of this town are doing such a wonderful job, let's go have a rally in their favor, censor. Okay? They don't care what you say about them. They only care what you can do. Okay? And if you think about it, it makes sense. But of course, it only makes sense after the fact, right? Why does it make sense? Well, because why should they care what you think about them? They're the dictators of this country, right? Why would you like them, right? Right? And imagine someone new coming to the web in China. I mean, what was the theory? The theory that we all had was, well, they censor criticism because the next person that comes to the web will see a more positive set of posts and they would think more positive things about the government. Wait a second, in a country where we know there's censorship, we only see positive things about the government, and we think more positive things about the leaders? That theory we all had it really doesn't hold up once you think about it. But what is it that the Chinese leaders are afraid of? They're not afraid of the US government. They're not afraid of the Western governments. They're afraid of the only thing that's going to get them thrown out of power. They're afraid of their own people. That's the only thing that could really get them thrown out. So if their own people say bad things about them, it just doesn't matter. But if their own people join together, that's what they need to stop. That's how they stay in office. That's how they get reelected in our terms. Okay. So I need to show you this is true. But if it's true, what's the consequence? The consequence is it makes social media actionable. It makes it actionable for the Chinese leaders because to measure criticism of local officials, they measure criticism in order to judge local officials. Okay, so suppose you're the head of all of China. Okay, you have more power than Bill Gates and Warren Buffett combined. Okay, you can do pretty much anything you want. What is it that you want? To keep a good thing going. Okay, that's what you want. Okay, so how do you keep a good thing going? Well, there's about 50,000 towns all across China, and you appoint the head of the Communist Party in each town. That's the head of it, and then you appoint the head of the government. So that's the second in command. So it's about 100,000 people. So now you have to manage 100,000 people, and of course these people, they're all stealing. They're what we would call corrupt, but they're corrupt in different ways. Sometimes they're too corrupt, and they may generate collective action on the part of the people that may then be contagious from town to town and may get you thrown out, right? So how do you monitor 50,000 towns and 100,000 people, plus all the people that work for them? How do you do that? Actually, criticism on social media is a great way, right? So instead of criticism being something that might offend the leaders, actually it's incredibly useful for them. That's what we think they're doing with it. So criticism on the web is actionable for the leaders. We think when there's criticism of local leaders, they take them out. In fact, we have evidence that they do that. Okay. And I don't mean take them out for drinks. Okay. And then they censor to stop events with collective action potential, right? Collective action and the potential for it. Okay. So what does that mean for us? It means that we can use the observation of criticism and the observation of censorship to reliably predict which officials are in trouble and which ones are going to be replaced. We can predict which policies generate dissent and also the interests of the leaders, what they're after. We can predict on the basis of the censorship behavior what the government's going to do outside the internet, actually on the ground. We have predicted dissidents which are going to be arrested ahead of time, peace treaties that were going to be signed, emerging scandals. You just get a different view of this universe than you'd seen before because of this kind of approach. We can also see things that China scholars speculate about, sort of endlessly, of course, because it's very important, which is disagreements between local and central leaders, which they don't talk about. We can see it because there's different censorship behaviors from the central government and local governments sometimes. So this is a big prize, but you shouldn't believe me yet. It's only sort of payable if we have the goals right. So I need to show you now that those goals, these two goals, are what we have. That the goal of censorship is not to stop criticism, that it is to stop collective action. So let me show you some of this. All right. First is our observational research design, and I'm going to show you that in 5 steps. The first step is that you can't look at all of social media. There's tons of it, and people in China talk about everything just like we do. They are as obsessed as Americans with cat videos, okay? and Lady Gaga and everything else, okay? So we don't want to just look at social media. You have to narrow it down somewhat. So we narrowed it down in the first instance to 85 different topic areas. We didn't know what to look at first. We picked 85 things that might be politically relevant. And we collected all social media posts in 1,400 separate social media sites over a 6-month period for our first study here. We downloaded every post the instant it appeared. Like the moment it appeared, we'd grab it. And then we would go back to each post to figure out whether it was censored. So how do you do that? Okay, so you just go click on the same URL and see whether it's there. Okay, but the problem is you don't know exactly when it's going to be censored, so you go click on it again. If it was censored, you know the answer. If it wasn't censored, you have to click on it again to see if it's censored then, and if it wasn't censored then, you have to click on it again. Okay, but we have like millions and millions of these posts, so how do we do this? Well, you can imagine you write a little loop that says, are you there? Are you there? Are you there? Are you there? So that's known as a denial of service attack. So that was a bad idea. So then what we realized is we created a network of computers around the world and used some existing networks. And we would check once from the US, and check once from Turkey, and check once from inside China, actually, and check once from all over the place, so that we wouldn't be messing with anybody. A computer scientist once pointed out to me that, Gary, that's a distributed denial of service attack. But actually, and it would be if we were doing it very fast, but actually our goal was not to interrupt or disturb or change the system we were studying. We wanted to study the system. We didn't want to change the system. I mean, it wasn't an option for a couple of Harvard people, okay? So we would very carefully do this from different places, and we would code each post as censored or not censored. Okay, so then we had our data set. And then basically we repeat the same thing 11 million times. And we did that again, so we have way more posts than this. But for this particular study, that was the original data set. We then used some of these new methods of automated text analysis to analyze this. Okay, so that's our first observational research design. It's observational because we didn't intervene or anything like that. There was no experiment. We just observed. Okay, so just to give you a feel for what happens, censorship is not ambiguous. Here's an example. When you click on it of an error page, it says, sorry, the host you're looking for does not exist, has been deleted, or in case you're not sure, is being investigated. Okay, and actually, this is my favorite one. Up in the top right-hand corner there, you say, the page you requested is temporarily down. How about you go look at another page? And if that's not sufficient, in the bottom right-hand corner there is Jing, one of China's cartoon internet police. He's the boy. There's also Cha-Cha, which is the girl. I think that's right. And they put them all over the web just to make sure that they know that you know that they are watching. Okay? There's nothing. They're not embarrassed about censorship. If you ask them about it, which we have, they're not embarrassed. They say, no, we do censorship, of course, because if we didn't do this, the country would fall apart into chaos. It's very important to censor. And, it's a hypothesis, and, I don't get to test it, right? Okay, so their sensors are fast, but our automated methods are faster. So in Shanghai, there was a subway crash. There was protests and riots about the subway crash. We knew there would be censorship based on what we were doing. We wanted to know exactly how long it took. We coded each post and went back to this network of computers around the world and just checked much, much more frequently so we could get an exact timeline of how long it took. This is the number of days that it takes for a post to be censored from this particular event. And almost all were censored within the first day. And almost all of those, by the way, were censored within the first few hours. So think about how this works. There's millions of people posting all over China. And within a few hours, they decide whether to censor a post. That's amazing. Okay? And it's by hand. Okay. You need to know something else about social media. Not only about social media in China, but about social media in general. So social media is bursty. Here's a plot of social media posts where the vertical axis is just a sample, but the vertical axis is a count, and gray is the volume of posts in this particular policy area. And this particular policy area was posts about the environment. Okay. So gray is the volume. Over here, you can see a big burst. The red are the ones of the volume that were censored, the posts of the total volume that were censored. So the red never gets above the gray because it's censored. I'm going to show you this kind of graph again, so just to give you that feel. And what happened here? Well, there was an environmental lottery, which is like a regular lottery that the officials of some town decided to have, but they announced that the proceeds from the lottery would go to environmental causes. And the people were quite thrilled with this. They thought, this is a really wonderful thing. And they went and had a rally for the leaders of this town. Right? So what happened? There was an enormous burst of activity telling everybody about this wonderful thing. Let's go and have a rally and tell the leaders that they're doing such a wonderful thing. And they followed them right up the hill and censored most of these posts. Okay? Right? They don't care what you say. They only care what you can do. We then developed a nice, cool statistical method to automatically discover the posts. And we were going to write a paper about it. And then we discovered it was exactly equivalent to a burst that was more than 3 standard deviations above the mean. So it's really easy to detect these things, right? So we have 85 topic areas. We found 87 bursts within the 85 topic areas. Some topic areas had none, some had 1, some had 2, et cetera. So we wanted to find those bursts. The bursts are what social media is about. Stuff goes viral, people share, people really focus attention, okay? So we then found the 87 bursts, and then we identified the real-world event that those 87 bursts were talking about. And that was our data, really. And here's our hypothesis. The government censors all the posts inside the volume bursts, not all the volume bursts, but inside the volume bursts that are associated with real-world events that have collective action potential. Okay? So it looks for the bursts. They look for the bursts. When they find a burst, they figure out what's this burst about. If the burst is about a collective action event, which I'll define more precisely later, they censor all the posts. They don't care whether it was in favor or opposed to the rally or anything. Okay. That enables them to not have to read really each individual post and make a decision, except for whether it was related to the burst or not. Right? But they don't have to figure out, are they encouraging this behavior or not? That would be way too hard. We would never get high levels of intercoder agreement. Okay. So let me start showing you some of the evidence that we've found. So first is just the volume. We take our 87 volume bursts. For each burst, I'm going to calculate the percent censorship, and then I'm going to subtract off the baseline. We subtract off the baseline in each separate policy area because we thought maybe the baselines would differ. As it happened, by the end of our study, as we cleaned up the data more and more, the baselines were all pretty similar. About 13% of all social media posts in China are censored. But in any event, we kept using this measure. So censorship magnitude is percent censored over and above baseline. Okay. That's our measure of how much censorship there is. So if the goal of censorship is to stop collective action, we're going to expect, on average, the percent censored should increase during volume bursts, and some bursts should have higher censorship than other bursts. So here's a histogram of the censorship within the bursts. So this is the horizontal axis is the amount of censorship. And there's most of the bursts are sort of centered around 0, which is baseline levels of censorship. But then there's a very long right tail of very high levels of censorship in those bursts. Okay, so that's the first hint. But we got to zoom in and figure out what those are. So in order to zoom in and figure out what these are, we have to have a classification of the events. Right? I can't just list all the events. So I will show you a lot of them, but I can't. We need a classification. So let me show you a classification. So this is going to be our classification. It's not going to be whether they're positive or negative. It's going to be what the event is about. And the first one is going to be the obvious one because it's our hypothesis, which is events with collective action potential. So let me tell you what this is, then I'll tell you our other categories. So events with collective action potential are events, real-world events, not just stuff goes viral on the web, but real-world events on the ground that involve protest or some type of organized crowd formation, again, outside the internet. Okay? Or there's 3 things. Or the burst is about individuals, typically dissidents, who have organized or incited collective action in the past, and there's a burst about that individual. If there is, then they'll go take it down. Okay? Even if there's no protest on the ground. And third, topics related to nationalism or nationalist sentiment, which the leaders are very they guard jealously, that have incited protest or collective action in the past. So this is our very specific categorization of collective action potential. We were obsessed with getting high levels of intercoder reliability, so we had different people code it, and actually it's very easy to get this right, which is why we think the Chinese government is actually doing it. I mean, literally 98.9% of our 2 coders agreed on this category. Okay, so it's really not an issue. Let me tell you one other thing, which is, until now, I kept from you the fact that we also found 2 smaller categories that are different than collective action potential, but are also censored. So let me just tell you about those 2 categories. They're smaller. The first one is particularly weird. Okay. You can censor in China anyone right up to the top leader except for the guys that run the censorship program. They will stop you. I don't even know if this is like official policy. I mean, we don't know anything. We don't know if anything's official policy, but I don't know if this is official policy. And I sort of imagine that there was no policy like this, but the censors themselves, they just didn't like this. They're working for the boss, and the boss gets criticized. They just stop that, you know? And then here's my megalomaniac hypothesis. I believe that the leaders of China, I don't believe, but one hypothesis is the leaders of China didn't even know this was happening, okay, right? But now they do. I mean, believe me, they know about our paper. Now they do. So here's my megalomaniac hypothesis is we go back, we check again, and they're not doing it anymore. Wouldn't that be the coolest thing? Anyway, let me go back to the position that I took earlier. We don't want to influence the system. Okay, so that's the second category that involves censorship. It's much less frequent, but it occurs. There's by the way, it's very easy to the encoder reliability here is also very high. It's easy to tell whether they're criticizing the censors because it'll be a bunch of students that are throwing shoes at the guy who runs the censorship program. You can tell. Okay, so there's a third category of things that are censored, and this is pornography. That's not a surprise. Basically, every government in the world censors something related to sex. Okay, they define pornography, that is sex that's not allowed, in different ways in different governments, including our own. But they censor pornography in China. We were similarly throughout the project. We're obsessed with intercoder reliability. You know it when you see it. Okay, there's no ambiguity there. Okay. And of course, all the posts in the third category we reserved for future study. Whenever I say that line, I'm scared to death that nobody's going to laugh. We also had two other categories. One is news about all kinds of other subjects, and the last one was posts about government policies. And just as a reminder, the first one is censored. The second one, the collective action, potential criticism of the censors, and pornography are all censored. And news about all kinds of topics, including very controversial topics, are not censored. And any discussion of government policies are not censored. Okay, so now I'm going to take those 5 categories, take that histogram, that smooth version of a histogram I showed you before, and I'm going to zoom in a little further and show you that same histogram, but broken down by the 5 categories. So we have the 5 categories here color-coded. The blue and purple are about policy and news that we said would not be censored. The horizontal axis here is the amount of censorship, the censorship magnitude. Over on the left is not censored. As you can see, those are those 2 categories. Over on the right, there's very high levels of censorship for collective action, criticism of the censors, and pornography. You see, so I would say it supports our ex-ante hypothesis, right? Okay. Let me zoom in a little further and give you a feel for this. So I list from the most censored at the top to the least censored at the bottom the individual events. I cut out the ones in the middle because couldn't fit them all on the slide. So on the top, protests in Inner Mongolia, pornography disguised as news. Pornographers there, they disguise it's not really disguised, but it's like you put pornography on the name of something that's being tweeted or retweeted, and then other people find it in a search. That's basically what they do. Baidu is like Twitter, but there. So the Baidu copyright lawsuit, which was about criticism of the censors, that was censored. Zhengcheng protests, so protests in this is a city in China where they make lychee nuts. You can see why they would protest, right? That was a joke that wasn't very funny, but I really enjoyed it. Anyway, pornography mentioning a popular book, right? Ai Weiwei, he's a dissident. Do you remember the last Winter Olympics? There was a big stadium that looked like a bird's nest, this beautiful stadium. So that was designed by Ai Weiwei. And he, after the Olympics, started tweeting about the Jasmine Spring, which was like the Arab Spring in China, and became a dissident, basically. Anyway, you go all the way down to the bottom, and the popular book published in audio format, not censored. Disney announces a new theme park. Chinese solar company announces earnings, etc. They're not censored. The ones that are censored are collective action, criticism of the censors, or pornography. Okay, let's zoom in a little further. Here's Zhengcheng again. So one of the topic areas was this city. This is the level of posts about this city. This is the censorship, very low levels of censorship, until there's riots in that city that we happen to capture during our observation period. And there's an enormous spike of discussion about those riots, and the censors follow them right up the hill and take them all down. You notice it's much harder. It would be presumably harder to censor in a focused emergency kind of period, but yet they do pretty well. Here's another one. This is Ai Weiwei, again, and he was arrested, and people like him, it seems, and there was an enormous amount of discussion about it, and you can see the censors follow him right up the hill and take down that whole hill. Okay, he's a dissident who had created collective action on the ground in the past. He said, let's protest. People went and protested. So now, anytime there is a volume burst of activity talking about him, they will take it down. Okay. How about, let's take a policy for which there was no collective action on the ground. A non-controversial policy like you shall only have one kid. Can you imagine in the US, right? There were definitely volume bursts about this policy, speculation about maybe they would relax the policy or something like that. But there was no protest on the ground, so there was no censorship, no big deal. Okay? Or about power prices. Power prices spark protests in lots of countries, including this one. But there was no protest on the ground. There was no collective action, right there in front of you. And so they didn't censor it. They didn't censor it except at baseline levels. Okay. Okay. So I'll show you just one thing, which is we developed this algorithm to work in Chinese, which was this cool thing that I really wanted to give a talk about today, but you wouldn't let me. And we wanted to predict the proportion in each of these 4 categories, and those are our estimates, and isn't that great? Doesn't that work really wonderful? And don't you really want to learn all the math behind it? Okay, so this just demonstrates to you that you can trust the next graph, okay? Okay, the next couple of graphs. So now I want to zoom in a little further, and I want to look at the content of the posts in the bursts that were censored and not censored, and figure out whether they were supportive or opposed to the government, and whether those levels of support, of criticism or support affected their censorship levels. Okay, so non-collective action of posts we find are not censored, regardless of whether they're critical or supportive of the government. Here's an example: the one-child policy. As I said, there was no collective action event. Where the vertical axis is the percent of posts that were censored. Regardless of whether you're critical or supportive of the government, when you post about a one-child policy, it's censored at basically baseline levels. So it's basically not censored. Corruption policy, food price rises. It doesn't matter whether it's critical, supportive. I have this is like I'm going to take this with me. Whether it's critical or supportive, it's very low levels of censorship. Okay, so now let me switch from these events, which were controversial but had no collective action on the ground, to 3 events that had collective action on the ground. So there's Ai Weiwei that I've told you about. There's a bombing in Fuzhou, which was a dissident action, and there were protests about it, and riots in Inner Mongolia. For each of these, the level of censorship was very high, regardless of whether you were critical of the government or supportive of the government, regardless of whether you were critical or supportive, regardless of whether you were critical or supportive. Okay? In fact, if you look at this, for 2 of these, the supportive posts were actually, for Ai Weiwei, let's say, were actually censored more than the supportive posts were critical, let me say this as a whole sentence. The supportive posts were censored more than the critical posts. Okay, both at a very high level. But even that, I mean, that's sort of crazy. In fact, it's even true here. I wouldn't take that as a pattern. It's not across a large variety of issues. It's that they don't care what you say. It may be that you're saying supportive things, but you're talking about the collective action event. They just take it down. Sometimes they're supportive, sometimes they're not supportive. It just doesn't matter to them. Okay. Okay. So that's our observational study. But I promised you 2 other studies, so let me show you these a little quicker. So we have 2 other additional research designs. First is a randomized experiment. When you do an observational study, you can't quite be certain of causality. We're getting much better at it, but still. So it'd be nicer to actually randomly assign posts and see what happens. Okay? That's a randomized experiment. In addition, we want to figure out exactly what randomized experiment to run, and that's going to be our participatory study. So I'll explain both of these. All right. So first of all, for our randomized experiment, we got data from 100 of the top social media sites, the biggest social media sites. We created from inside China, at these localities, 100 localities, 2 accounts on each one. Okay. For many of these, you can't just like sign on them from the US. You have to have like a local telephone number or things like that. So I'm not going to tell you all the details of how we did this, but you can imagine this is quite a logistical challenge to sign up for all these accounts all over China. I'll just pause for silence while you imagine what we did. Okay. And then we wrote social media posts that we're going to randomly assign to these different sites. We wrote 1,200 Chinese language social media posts. Each one was different from every other one, and none of them had appeared on the web before. Okay. And we were writing them, and some of them were about events with collective action. Some of them were about events without collective action. Some were in favor of the government. Some were opposed to the government. So we wanted to test all these hypotheses. Now, we were writing about events that were happening, so we had to write them right then. So how do you write 1,200 Chinese language posts right then? Okay. So what we did is we had a large number of Chinese-speaking research assistants. And actually, as it turned out, we had a large number of volunteers that, in academia, the coin of the realm is being thanked or a citation or something. And the only condition under which our volunteers would volunteer would be if we did not tell anybody that they helped us. But they were enthusiastic. So we had sort of the equivalent of a big pizza party. In fact, it was like a big pizza party with, you have all your students have a big pizza party. We just had Chinese food. So we really did. And we very carefully monitored the news. When we found an event, we said, okay, go. And we wrote a post, and we had very careful ways of checking each other's work. Okay. So now we had these 1,200 social media posts. We did it in 3 waves, but in any event, we then randomly assigned them to be posted on these 100 sites inside China. Okay. And then we had this network of computers around the world to check on each of them to see whether they were censored. Okay. So we had to figure out whether to do this. That's what we did. I'm going to show you what the results are. But just to back up a second, this participatory study. Okay. How do you know that that's the relevant thing? How do you know where the social media sites are? How do you know how they censor? How do you know what their procedures are? How do you find these things out? Right? In the US, if we were studying the bureaucracy, right, we'd just go and, interview people, right? So you can do good journalism in China, but it's just difficult. Actually, journalism itself is pretty difficult. As a lot of you know, you have to ask someone to step aside from their life and give you some time for nothing, okay? And now what we're going to do is we're going to be interviewing censors, okay? And asking them to share information with us, right? Not the perfect kind of situation, right, with an interviewee and interviewer, right? And if they talk to us, and we have talked to them, and they have talked to us, it's not quite clear what you do with that information. Like, what would they be telling us? Like, is that the truth? Is that what they think they want us to hear? Is that what they think their bosses want them to? Who knows, right? So it's very difficult. There's been a lot of work trying to get that information. There are a lot of censors, so you can actually do that. And I've given talks like this one, and there have been some in the audience, actually, which is pretty cool. But in any event, we wanted a way to change our sources' incentives. The problem was that they wouldn't really talk to us. We had to change their incentives. How do you change somebody's incentives? Well, we can't really pay them off. We need bigger research accounts than this, all right, than we have. And we're not going to do that anyway, okay? But that's what we needed to do. We needed to change their incentives, okay? So here's our procedure to learn about things and in part to change their incentives, okay? So we created our own social media site in China, which sounds pretty weird, right? But China is a communist country, but it's also a capitalist country. They're happy to do stuff for money, right? So first thing we did is we purchased a URL. Then we rented server space. Then we went to the companies that make social media sites that you can install, and we licensed the software from them. And we installed it ourselves on the site, right? And we got it up and running. The only thing we didn't do is let the Chinese people post, because then we would be legally required to censor them. So we didn't do that. So like Molly would censor me, and so I'd censor her right back, and then and we'd censor each other, and we'd play with the machine that we were trying to reverse engineer. We had the machine that we could use, right? We weren't just like looking at it through a telescope. We had it in front of us, right? We could try things. We could see all the options. There were way more than we thought. We had the documentation for the thing we were trying to reverse engineer, okay? Okay, so so then how do we change the sources' incentives? Well, the cool thing was, if we had questions, which we did, we called customer service, the customer service of the people who make the software. And it's their job to help us. It's their job to make it easy for us. So we would call them up and say, so how do we stay out of trouble with the Chinese government? And they would say, let me tell you. And we got an enormous amount of information from them, right? So this was tremendously valuable information. This helped us figure out what experiment to run. Let me give you a feel for what we learned, okay? When you submit a text for posting on the web, here's what happens. There's another step that I haven't shown you, because up here is the part that I've talked about so far. The part down here I haven't talked about, but I'm going to now. So we learned that what happens is you submit something for posting, and it is sometimes published immediately, but not always. Sometimes if it matches certain keywords, then it gets held and put into purgatory. The posts I've talked to you about get posted instantly the moment you write them, and then the censors at some point later decide whether to take it down. The ones that match certain keywords on certain sites, all sites don't do this, but some sites do this. If they match certain keywords, if you use certain words, it will immediately be put into this purgatory. And the censors then read them and decide whether to put them up on the web or just let them die. Okay, so this is another piece of the process, right? These, if you're reading these are actual social media posts translated into English by someone other than me. So if it's published immediately, it either remains online or it gets taken down. If it is immediately held for review before publication by keyword matching, it may be published after review, or it may be deleted during review. You can also get your account blocked. And just below the bottom of the screen, there's other stuff that can happen to you, which we'll just leave that aside. Okay. 64% of websites review some content, and 40% of all submissions reviewed. 40% of all submissions are reviewed. That is, go into this automated review process. So everything I told you so far about this observational study, maybe you shouldn't believe me, right? Maybe because, maybe there's just this enormous selection bias, because a lot of the posts we don't know. Now, how do you get to know about the posts that you put in but get immediately deleted? Our observational systems wouldn't be able to detect that, right? How do we study that? Well, you got to know about the posts going in. So we wrote posts and we put them in. If you know what's going in, you know what's coming out. Which reminds me of my next-door neighbor at the University of Wisconsin when I was in graduate school. He was studying meat science, and he had that's an actual major, meat science, and he had 6 genetically identical cows, and he knew everything going in and he knew everything coming out. And at the time, I was studying members of Congress, thinking, could I do something like that? In any event, this is my next best, right? So we then, when we submit a post, we could see whether it was held for review, right? So this gives us an additional visibility into the system. Doing the experimental study gives us additional visibility into the system. Okay, so let's look at some of the results. First, I'm going to do posts for the government versus against the government. The causal effect of writing a post for the government versus against the government, which we did. We wrote it for the government or against the government about the same events. Okay. So the first one was a protest in Pensu. This is the causal effect. That is 0. Okay. Zero is the point. It's about 0 plus a confidence interval. So the causal effect of writing for the government as opposed to against the government, there's no difference in the percent censored. Everybody see? Okay, because now I'm going to do the same thing, a bunch more times. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, one more. Okay, so these are all the events that we found, The first 4 are events that have collective action potential. The rest of them don't, because there was nothing happening on the ground, at least at the time. The causal effect in each of these areas of writing posts for the government versus against the government, you had the same level of censorship in both. So in conclusion, the randomized study shows it doesn't matter what you say about them. They don't care. Okay, what about writing about collective action events versus writing about some other events? Right? That's our, what we thought we found. Okay, so again, the vertical axis here is the censorship difference, but now it's the difference from a collective action event, from about writing about a collective action event compared to writing about another event at the same moment in time that was not a collective action event. Okay, so so what's the causal effect there? The vertical axis is the same, although you know what the results are going to be because I have 0 down here. Okay, so this is the first one. This pantsuit protest. There's big causal effects. Okay, in all these cases, the effects are way above 0. Okay, so if you write about collective action, you're going to be censored. If you write about something else, you're not. If you write for or against the government in a collective action event or not a collective action event, it doesn't matter. Okay, let me tell you about one other cool thing, and then I'll stop. Okay, so one of the things we had to do was we had to follow the conversation. There's this automated review. And in automated review, here's some of the things that would happen. Does anybody know what that means? So that means freedom in Chinese. Okay? And that's censored. Actually, it's not censored. What it is it's keyword blocked. Okay? So it's not somebody who's not reading it. But at least at the first instance, it gets into the keyword filters. Okay? What is that? Now look closely at this. This is not the same thing as that. Okay? What does that mean? It means I fields. What is I fields? I field means I, and then a big field of daisies. Okay? It has no meaning. Okay? It's nonsensical. The Chinese people are very smart when they post on social media. They know they learned that they couldn't say freedom, so they can say I field, and other people that read it know what they mean. So they say we think that there should be much more I field in China, right? And they get it. Okay? That's not censored. This is called a homograph. Okay? You can't do that in English. It's sort of cool. Here's another example. This means the harmonious society, which is the official slogan of the Chinese Communist Party. And that is, again, not censored. It's keyword blocked. You can't really say that, right? They'll just filter it out. This one, which looks completely different, means river crab. Okay? And it's thoroughly irrelevant. It looks different, but it sounds in Chinese almost the same. Okay? Every time I try to pronounce this with Chinese people in the audience, I don't come close to their repronunciation of it, so I'll just say it looks like that. Okay. So that's another thing that they can do, and they could say, the policy of the harmonious, the policy of the river crab totally sucks, right? They can say that, right? So the interesting thing is they can't follow the conversation, and because the Chinese people have found ways around it, right? We don't have, and for the Chinese leaders, this is not a problem because eventually they read by hand with their 100 or 200,000 people, right? So unfortunately, we don't have those kinds of research resources, right? So we couldn't do it by hand. We had to follow the conversation automatically with these methods of automated text analysis. So we developed some methods to discover these keywords that hadn't actually been mentioned, right? Like, to surface river crab that was being used in similar ways to harmonious society. And so we developed these other cool methods. See, I got to talk about my methods, Jeff. Jeff and I spend most of our lives trying to trick people into listening to us talk about methods. So they can't follow the conversation, but we can. This would produce a very nice contract, I imagine, from the Chinese government, but not interested, thank you. Government or financial analysts actually have the same job not that they have the same job, they have the same need. Because if you're an analyst tracking a stock or a terrorist or something like that, you have this saved search. And you come up with a list of keywords, and you want if you have too many keywords, you get overwhelmed. If you have too few, you miss all the information. And so this will discover the right keywords for you. And there's other things. A year and a half ago, those of us in Boston were all sort of hunkered down during the marathon bombings, and none of the news media had any information. So we went to Twitter, which also had no information, but it was somewhat more entertaining. We'd follow anything with hashtag Boston bombings at the end of the line. And then at some point during the day, for community spirit and political reasons, people stopped using hashtag Boston bombing, some, and they started using hashtag Boston strong to say, you know, we're better than, or I don't know what it was, you know. It was community spirit or something. If you didn't know that, you'd lose the thread of the conversation. Right? It's the same exact problem as up there. Or we've helped Department of Homeland Security how they look for things they want to censor on the web, which is basically child pornography. Look-alike modeling, which is if you want to find a data analyst or data scientist, which I highly recommend, you can search for data scientist, but you could also search for political methodologist, statistician, econometrician, and there's about 100 other words. But would you think of them all? Right? So this will help find it. Anyway, so let me just conclude. Here's a tagline for you to remember. About freedom of speech, about speech. The Chinese people are individually free and collectively in chains. Okay, so that's designed for quoting. Okay. Social media, analyzed the right way, can enable detailed, continuous, predictive monitoring of every Chinese government leader, policy, dissident, scandal, company, whatever it is you want to know. We could set up a big monitoring system. It predicts state actions outside the web. I haven't shown you that evidence when other sources are silent. It's applicable to some other countries where we're having a peak at the moment. We have some new statistical methods that seem to be applicable widely beyond this application area, which, of course, had nothing to do with the project originally. We can follow conversations when people try to evade authorities intentionally or unintentionally or for political purposes, predicting action on the ground, understanding large volumes of text. There may be applications to other different areas, and that's where you find me. So, thank you. So I'd love to hear you, any questions, or if you want to yell out obscenities or whatever you like. Sure.
Hi, Mr. King. My name is Jaja. I'm from China. Very nice to meet you.
You too?
I hope that I won't get arrested.
This is just between us. So
now I'm like free and I'm safe, right? Okay. So I see that from your speech, basically your studies were mainly about the domestic censorship that's in China, right? I was just curious. Did you also study like the censorship towards the outside of China? For example, the fact that the Chinese government blocked Google, YouTube, Facebook, and the fact that recently all the VPN, which is the short term for that's the method for Chinese people to get outside of the censorship in order to go on Google or YouTube. Yet, so those VPN service has been blocked recently.
Right.
I was just curious. Have you been also studying?
Yeah, so I have to talk over here, but actually the VPN was the article that Jim mentioned earlier, although that's been happening gradually over the last couple of weeks. We have, but we didn't really have anything new to contribute about your first topic was basically the Great Firewall, it's called, of China. So Facebook can't get into China, or Google can't get in there. That's much easier to study. You can just see whether they're in or not in. You know, there's some that are partially in, like Gmail is sort of partially in, and not at the moment, but they were previously. So, you know, we tried to make a contribution, and so we're academics. We try to say new things, and so yes, we've studied it. We follow it very closely, and in fact, the interesting thing about your question is that what's going on in China is it's not like our results are fixed forever. I think actually the incentives are probably going to stay there because they make perfect sense. But what goes on in social media is going to change all the time. So since we did our first study, WeChat has come up. So WeChat is sort of like text messaging to as many as 100 people, but no more. So it's sort of a constrained thing. You can't broadcast to 1 million people. And there's other kinds of things. And so I think your question is important. We have to keep studying these things as social media evolves, and it does evolve pretty quickly.
So there are some important documents that have come out in China for guiding the way propaganda is discussed. Like they're called Document 9 and Document 30. document 9's been distributed, document 30's only been distributed verbally. I'm wondering if the guidance in those documents gets to the censors, and the censors act in terms of those guidance, or if those documents are irrelevant for the censors and only relevant for other types of control.
Yeah.
We need to have you repeat it in order to get the sound for the video.
Oh, okay. So the question is what about the formal promulgated rules of censorship? And there are some ones that are leaked and we don't know whether they're real, and then there's some that you can actually see. So my view of the rules, if you look at them closely, which we have, is it's very hard to tell what's really a rule and what's not a rule. So and I finally came to this conclusion quite firmly when I saw that one of the things in China that is illegal is to spread rumors on social media. Now, if you think about it, what is the point of social media except to spread rumors, right? So that means they can arrest anybody at any time who posts something on social media. So it's not quite that bad in general because there are some, it's sort of like, if you're going 60 miles an hour on the highway and it's a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit and you get pulled over, you're sort of wondering why, right? Because like everybody's going by, because everybody knows, well, the real speed limit it's really like, maybe 64 or something like that. You don't really know, okay? It's just that kind of thing applies to like everything there. So we don't really know, and the definitions change all the time. So it's very hard. So.
Gary.
Oh, sure.
Oh. Dr. King, for somebody who barely passed statistics, your work is just amazing. And
Are you talking about me?
absolutely amazing. And so much of your information can be very helpful to certainly China policymakers. And I wonder whether you could sort of demonstrate the predictability of what you've worked out. One of the major topics among China watchers now has to do with Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign. From your information, can you kind of guess or estimate whether the campaign is really to root out corruption, or is it really to root out his enemies? And even more, I mean, maybe your methodology could better do this. Can you predict the next tiger, in this campaign? The people call the officials who are caught tigers, flies. Tigers are the big ones, the flies are the little ones. So who besides Zhou Yongkang will be the next tigers, Bo Xilai and Zhou Yongkang?
Yeah.
Who will be the next tigers to be caught or to be punished by Xi Jinping?
Yeah. So we can make. So the question is there's a big crackdown going on in China right now, and we don't really know whether they're after corruption, of which there is plenty, or it's a political crackdown to try to get rid of the enemies of the present leader, or whether actually there isn't any difference between the two. It's not entirely clear. And the question was, could I tell the difference? I'm not sure I know the answer yet. But could we use these methods to study that? Yes, I think we could. So I think there's many of these leaders are talked about in social media. So we have some sense of what the public thinks of them. We know who they are and where they are. We know which ones are taken out. We can see whether we can predict which ones are taken out. I may actually be describing a current research project that we're in the middle of. But we don't actually know. I don't actually know the answer yet. So.
You will.
Well, we're going to see. we'll call you up. Yeah. No, we would like to do that. The difficulty is, we're three people, and China is like a little bigger than us, and it's just you need big resources to be able to go to study everything. Like people will often ask questions. Well, did you study this? Did you study this? This. You can get the great thing about having 1,400 social media sites across China is we can get geographic differences across different parts of China, which can reveal things that we wouldn't have been able to see otherwise. Even in the U.S., there's a very small fraction of social media posts that are publicly available that you can geocode. In China, we can geocode quite a lot of them because you only post locally. Not all of them, but for some of them. So there's all kinds of, to the question, could you study that? The answer is usually yes. To the question, have you studied that? The answer is usually not yet.
Carol Laval, Dean of the School of Professional Extended Studies. I am struck by the fact that you have presented an image here of a highly experiential, very accessible form of both quantitative and qualitative research. And it is connecting the kinds of things that we're trying to do, certainly at this university and elsewhere, where we get the number crunchers and the participatory folks together with those who actually have to apply this in the real world. Could you tell us a little bit more about the students and how they responded to the research? What has happened? Are they all political scientists? Did they come from different fields to work with you? How is this extending to other areas beyond your own program?
So lots of students have been interested, quantitative students, qualitative students, students that study China, students that say they would really like to help, but they don't know Chinese and don't know quantitative analysis, but they really think like we really like to participate. And you know, we can't include everybody, but there are lots of people that are interested in lots of different things. Some of them have told us they've been motivated to go back and learn some of the techniques that enable them to do things like this, which is quite gratifying. But on your first question, which was great, which is the difference between quantitative and qualitative methods, and that maybe this is sort of a combination of the two, which it exactly is. I think actually the bigger picture that this is part of is that the difference between quantitative and qualitative methods is basically going away. And one of the things paradoxically, one of the things that I believe is making it go away is sort of the big data movement. Well, why would that be? It's not because like the qualitative people are getting crushed. That's ridiculous. All research is qualitative. Some fraction of it is also quantitative. Okay, purely quantitative research is an Excel spreadsheet with no column or row labels. Right, it's not very helpful. Okay, but with big data, the really interesting thing is that we can now analyze stuff that we previously thought was qualitative. The qualitative researchers, they're being overwhelmed by information. What are you supposed to do with 15,000 pages of field notes or video or audio from all of your research, right? As it happens, as quantitative analysts, we are beginning to be able to analyze this quantitatively. Not as well as a human being could reading one text or watching one video, but better, way better than a human being could looking at them all. And so I think the qualitative analyst needs some help and has some tremendous expertise. The quantitative analyst has more data sets to play with and can use the qualitative, needs the qualitative expertise from the qualitative researchers. And so more and more, I think I think the main division in the social sciences and many of the professions, which is between quantitative and qualitative, is, you know, to some extent it'll always be there, but it's really, the two are really merging. And that's a really terrific thing for everybody. So.
Yeah, it looks like there's a dynamic feedback process in the censorship, because it looked like after a peak of censorship, you'd see that the percentage of censorships would actually be declining. Is that a learning process on the behalf of the public, figuring out these alternate keywords? Or is it something that happens at a place that I work at where we begin to not classify things because we realize it's just not worth the effort?
You do have to tell us where you work.
No.
Thank you for telling us. I don't know. I think that's an interesting. So the question is, he's looking at the particular graphs and is seeing patterns in what happens right after censorship. And maybe if we looked at a large number of these, we would see a particular pattern. And what's going on is the interplay, the cat and mouse game between the censors and the censored. And you know, the people don't like the censorship. It's not that they necessarily want to get rid of it, but they don't like it. I mean, a lot of them want to get rid of it, but in any event, they certainly don't like when it affects them. And they try to work their way around it. And then the censors try to stop them from working their way around it. You know, the VPN story of today was, it used to be that the people were censored, but the intelligentsia, they could do what they want. They could use Gmail, they could use Google, you could use Facebook. It's really, you know, it was okay. It was the intelligentsia, because they're not going to be on the ground protesting. But those rules just changed, right? Like apparently that's not true anymore, or at least today it's not true. We'll see what's happening tomorrow. So it may be that there's, I mean, your point is really interesting because it may be that there's a particular interaction that happens once the people see censorship, respond in a particular way, and then the censors respond in response to that, and then the result is we see a particular pattern. So.
Over the macro size, you may find that there's actually a definite time period to it. It may be a very consistent periodicity.
Yeah, it could be. It could be
at a big data level.
Yeah, it could be a consistent periodicity. I think that's a good point. But
I have a related question. I'm looking at the implementation of environmental policies in China. We find very systematic patterns of top-down rules that are implemented at the local level. Sometimes, and other rules that are equally top-down but that are not implemented. One set of rules that people pay attention to are rules that affect environmental quality. My question, and there's been organized protest that we know about regarding environmental quality, particularly air quality, because it's visible, it's really visible. So my question is the censorship, it's actionable by the censors, but is it actionable by local officials who are not censors? In other words, does it convey information that can be used by the Chinese bureaucracy, not only at the central level, but also at the very specific local levels?
you mean does the censorship convey information to other officials?
Yes, and particularly at the local level.
It's possible. We don't know everything about what the censors see, of course, right? We know the consequence of what they do. We have some information.
The censors do what you do.
Well, they actually get to censor. You know? Wouldn't it be fun to do that for a day, right? I don't want to do that. So where are they getting their signals? And how does the flow of information go? I mean, really, like is there a central office that says today we're going to be focusing on this event? Okay, everybody out there, go make sure you. I mean, it may be. I mean, we think there's some messages like that, or it may be an emergent property. It may be just everybody sort of does it.
If it's an emergent property, somebody's got to be there looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think one interesting sort of academic question is, who thought of this idea? Who thought of the idea to not censor criticism but to censor collective action? Like, was there some evil genius who just came up with this idea? Or, I mean, because we can't find anybody who actually made the decision. Of course, we wouldn't necessarily be able to, but we haven't been able to. It may be that a really cool thing is maybe it was just like a whole bunch of censors. They were told to go censor things that were relevant, and it just sort of happened. Just an emergent property. I don't know. Back there. Yeah.
Thomas Seitzoff, the assistant professor in the School of Public Affairs. Really interesting presentation. One thing that I was wondering is you were talking about your interaction with the Chinese government and the censors themselves. So I wonder, one, I'm guessing they probably read your papers and your projects, and have they responded? Have they updated? I mean, in my work in the Middle East, I know that on social media, strategies continually change. So I wonder, has there been any since you guys have published this?
So, so the question is, has the Chinese government called you up and said anything? I guess a government doesn't just call you up. We probably have received some messages from them in certain ways. However, at the end of the day, we are not, I keep repeating that we're not trying to change anything in the system. We're just studying it. They seem to be okay with that, and they seem to be okay with scholarship. They seem to be okay with studying. You didn't ask this question, but I have collaborators and research assistants that that we're obsessive with protecting, and we work very hard to make sure that what we're doing is going to not stop them from being able to go back to study China. In one case, to go back to her family. We have a whole lot of research assistants, so we take this extremely seriously. And one thing I'll say is that my papers, which have been on my website from the moment we wrote them and made them public, are not censored from China. So you can go to China, you can get my website. And we are aware that the Chinese government, that this was very visible in China, among the Chinese people and among the government as well. So that's what we know. So.
I wonder about the Falun Gong, and there are active people in this country demonstrating and so on, not necessarily in China. When I've been in China and you ask about it, you can't get anybody to talk about it.
Well, there were protests related to Falun Gong, so that's exactly the kind of thing that they would censor, and they do seem to censor it quite seriously. So, yeah.
My understanding about the Falun Gong is the government couldn't care less about them until they started doing mass protests, and that's when they came on the radar. Their ideology really didn't matter to the Chinese governments. It was the fact that they were engaging in collective action.
Just to repeat what you said, I think that's absolutely right. I think they didn't care they didn't care about the ideology of this group. They cared about the fact that they could move people. I think that's that's at least completely consistent with everything else we've seen. So I think that would make sense. Probably you can have almost any ideology there, and as long as there's no chance you're going to be moving people, they probably wouldn't care less. So, I mean, we opened up our own social media website. Right? We opened it up. We were open for business. We didn't really tell people about it. But we did whatever we wanted. Right? If we opened it up for business and there were a lot of Chinese people there and we started communicating with them and it might have actually generated some protest on the ground, then I think we would have been in trouble. Right? So I think that's what they care about. So the non-barbarians are at the gates.
That's terrific. Wonderful.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Gary. I also want to thank Jeff Gill again, and I want you to stand. I didn't have you stand before. What you've done for us, and Bob Jernigan was on his dissertation committee from Mass Stat. We actually got along, the two departments, very well. And since then, it was great. Thank you. That was terrific.